December 18, 1944. The air above the Ardennes was heavy with smoke, the distant thunder of artillery echoing through the frozen forests. German soldiers huddled in makeshift foxholes, their breath visible in the bitter winter air, their ears tuned to the familiar drone of Allied aircraft. The sound was unmistakable, the low hum of engines that had carried destruction across cities, convoys, and armored columns. They braced themselves for the inevitable, a rain of fire, steel, and death. Yet what descended from the sky that morning was not the expected storm of bombs. Parachutes bloomed against the grey clouds like strange white flowers, and beneath them, instead of explosives, fluttered small bundles wrapped in paper tumbling gently toward the earth. The soldiers blinked in disbelief. Was this a trick, a cruel mockery before the killing blow? They scrambled from their dugouts, hands reaching hesitantly toward the packages as they touched the snow. Inside, chocolate bars, peppermint, chewing gum, sweetness where there should have been shrapnel. A battlefield transformed, if only for a heartbeat, into something surreal. For the first time in months, these hardened men tasted sugar, and with it came confusion, fear, and an inexplicable wave of memory that pierced deeper than any bullet. The Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun only days earlier, on December 16th. German forces had unleashed their last desperate gamble against the advancing Allies, striking with tanks, artillery, and infantry through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Wehrmacht hoped to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on their terms. It was a brutal clash in bitter winter, with American units often encircled and cut off, fighting for survival against relentless assaults. Every soldier knew the sound of aircraft above meant death. Strafing P-47s, thunderbolts diving with bombs screaming from their wings, German columns torn apart in firestorms. Yet here, in the midst of that apocalyptic struggle, came something wholly unexpected. It was not mercy, not surrender, but something far stranger: candy. For the German soldiers who stumbled upon these strange drops, terror was not absent. Fear gripped them, not because of what they saw, but because they could not understand it. War had conditioned them to expect cruelty, not kindness. Every lesson drilled into them by officers, every speech by Goebbels, had painted the Americans as ruthless, mechanized killers, soulless men who fought with machines and had no honor. But when chocolate melted on their tongues, the propaganda cracked. What was this strategy? Could it be poisoned? A trick to sap morale? A psychological weapon more insidious than flame or shell? To taste sweetness in the heart of hell was almost unbearable. Some men spat it out, others devoured it greedily, their minds racing, unable to reconcile this simple gift with the brutality surrounding them. The act itself was born not of pity for the enemy, but of a strange kind of improvisation by American pilots and ground units. Supplies meant for liberated villages and for their own troops were sometimes dropped near German lines by accident, or in moments of defiance, deliberately. In towns like Bastogne and St. Vith, as civilians starved under siege and children's eyes followed the rumble of Allied convoys, GIs shared their rations, Hershey bars, Wrigley's gum, lifesavers. For men who had known only hunger, such things became more precious than gold. Yet when the same rations landed near captured or retreating Germans, they carried a darker undertone. To give candy instead of bombs was to remind the enemy, "We have so much abundance we can waste it on luxury. You fight with steel and desperation. We fight with chocolate, cigarettes, and music. Who then has already won?" Imagine the psyche of a German private, his stomach empty, his frost-bitten hands trembling as he opened a wrapper that smelled of sugar and home. He remembered his childhood before the war, before the indoctrination, before the endless march of blood and iron. He thought of Christmas markets, gingerbread, and warm kitchens. And in that instant, the mask of the soldier slipped. For some, it was a moment of despair, a realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford kindness. For others, it was terror itself, an acknowledgement that the Reich's promises of supremacy were hollow, that the Americans wielded not only overwhelming firepower, but also the power of symbols, of culture, of soft strength that pierced deeper than any bullet. A chocolate bar in a frozen trench became a weapon of psychological warfare, unplanned yet devastating. Reports filtered back through German lines. Prisoners of war whispered about it in camps. They drop candy, some said. Not bombs, candy. The words spread like wildfire, sowing both disbelief and unease. Was this propaganda? A trick meant to soften them before capture? Or worse, a sign that the Americans were so confident, so secure in victory, that they could mock their enemies with gifts? Officers tried to stamp it out, declaring it lies. Yet the stories persisted. Men who had tasted it could not be silenced. They carried wrappers in their pockets as strange trophies, reminders of a surreal encounter with the enemy. And the more they thought about it, the more it gnawed at them. To fight against tanks, artillery, and aircraft was one thing. To fight against a nation that rained chocolate from the sky, what sense could be made of that? For the Americans, the act was often simple, spontaneous. GIs tossing candy from convoy trucks to children lining the roads. Airmen dropping rations when bombing runs were cancelled. Acts of human instinct, born from boredom, compassion, or even humor. Yet on the receiving end, among those who wore grey uniforms marked with eagles and swastikas, it became something else entirely. It became a question that could not be answered with rifles or grenades. Why would the enemy feed us? Why would they give us sweetness when we expect fire? The dissonance struck harder than artillery. In war, the unexpected is always the most terrifying. By late December, as the battle raged on, the snow stained with blood and wreckage, those small moments of surreal mercy were remembered more vividly than the thunder of guns. For German prisoners marched into captivity, chocolate bars handed by American guards became the first taste of defeat. Not bitter, but sweet, confusingly sweet. To them it was not kindness alone, but a reminder of disparity. Their nation crumbled, their supplies vanished. Yet their enemies had enough abundance to turn war into theater, to transform the battlefield into a stage where even candy could be a weapon. The men who once believed in the unbreakable power of the Reich now trembled at the thought of what America represented. Not just bombs and tanks, but a civilization of plenty that they could never match. And so in the forests of Belgium, beneath the roar of engines and the crash of artillery, a strange weapon fell from the skies. Wrapped in paper, light as air, harmless to the touch, yet capable of shattering morale as surely as any shell, German soldiers chewed nervously, their minds unraveling, realizing that sometimes the sweetest taste carries with it the bitterest truth. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had entered its final, desperate year. The Reich, once triumphant across Europe, was bleeding on every front. In the east, the Red Army surged relentlessly toward the Vistula and beyond. In the west, Anglo-American forces had broken out of Normandy, swept through France, and were pushing steadily toward the German border. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Factories lay in ruins under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns, and morale among German troops had begun to crack. Yet Adolf Hitler clung to the belief that a single bold strike might reverse the tide. That strike came in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble. It was in this theater that the bizarre and almost unbelievable tales of candy falling from the skies found their place. For both sides, the Ardennes was a battlefield of extremes. Snow-choked forests concealed tanks and infantry. Roads were clogged with retreating civilians, convoys of supply trucks and columns of desperate soldiers. Ammunition and food were precious commodities. For the German side, shortages were crippling. Fuel was so scarce that entire divisions were immobilized, their armored vehicles abandoned. Rations were pitiful, sometimes reduced to thin soup or scraps of stale bread. Hunger gnawed at every man. Into this desperate landscape came a cultural clash as stark as the thunder of artillery. The Americans marched with abundance. Their supply lines stretched across oceans, supported by an industrial machine unmatched in human history. Liberty ships bristling with cargo unloaded endless supplies in the ports of Normandy. From there, convoys pushed forward, feeding the soldiers at the front. Each GI carried not only ammunition and weapons, but rations that included cigarettes, instant coffee, and most astonishing of all, candy. Hershey bars, Tootsie Rolls, Wrigley's gum. For American soldiers, these were tokens of home comforts tucked inside combat gear. For the Germans, they became symbols of an unimaginable disparity, evidence of an enemy that could wage total war and still afford luxuries. Context is everything. By 1943, German soldiers had become accustomed to shortages. Their rations declined steadily in both quality and quantity. Herzet's coffee made from acorns replaced real beans. Bread was cut with sawdust or potato starch. Meat was a rarity, sugar almost unknown. Civilians at home fared little better. The Reich's propaganda machine painted these sacrifices as necessary, part of a noble struggle against a decadent enemy. Yet the enemy across the line seemed to live in another world. The sight of American convoys overflowing with crates of chocolate and gum shattered illusions of equality. In German eyes, this abundance was more terrifying than the enemy's tanks or aircraft. It suggested a depth of resources that no last gamble could overcome. American doctrine itself emphasized this advantage. The U.S. Army believed that morale was as essential as firepower. To keep soldiers fighting, they needed not only bullets and fuel but comforts that reminded them of home. Hence the rations, compact, calorie-dense, and yes, sweet. Hershey had developed a special bar for combat use, the D ration, a dense, bitter chocolate fortified with vitamins. Later, the more palatable tropical bar was produced, designed to resist melting in hot climates. These bars became a standard part of every GI's pack. They were small enough to carry into combat, sturdy enough to survive rough handling, and energizing enough to sustain men in the field. To an American, they were food and morale in a single bite. To a German, who had not tasted real chocolate in months, they were a revelation. The cultural clash went beyond rations. It reflected a deeper mismatch in strategic expectations. German soldiers were raised on the myth of sacrifice, the idea that endurance and iron will could overcome material shortages. American doctrine, by contrast, rejected the notion of fighting with less. The United States waged war with the principle of overwhelming abundance. If one tank was good, 1,000 were better. If one radio was useful, every squad would have one. If one ration could sustain a soldier, then it should also bring comfort, a taste of home. This mindset baffled the Germans. To them, the candy was not merely food, it was proof of the enemy's inexhaustible strength. At the higher levels of command, these differences played out in strategy. Hitler believed that the Ardennes offensive could shock the Allies into submission. His generals, however, knew that material realities told a different story. The Wehrmacht's fuel reserves were so low that armored spearheads were timed to capture Allied fuel depots. Ammunition stockpiles were dangerously thin. Supplies for the offensive were scavenged from other fronts. In contrast, the Americans fought with warehouses of material behind them, convoys stretching for miles, and aircraft constantly ferrying goods to the front. The candy drops were not a planned strategy, but they became an inadvertent demonstration of this overwhelming advantage. For civilians in occupied Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland, American candy symbolized liberation. Children lined the roads as convoys passed, hands outstretched, waiting for soldiers to toss them sweets. It became a ritual, a bond between liberators and the liberated. For German soldiers, who often witnessed the same scenes, it was another reminder of disparity. The civilians who once welcomed them with forced obedience now cheered the enemy, rewarded not with promises but with tangible gifts. A chocolate bar in the hands of a child became as much a weapon of propaganda as any leaflet dropped from the sky. The broader war situation only magnified this psychological contrast. By the final months of 1944, Germany had already suffered catastrophic defeats. The Red Army had destroyed Army Group Center in Operation Bagration. Allied forces had liberated Paris and were driving toward the Rhine. The Reich's allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, were collapsing or switching sides. In this context, the stories of candy drops carried symbolic weight far beyond their immediate moment. They encapsulated the hopelessness of the German position, a nation starving, clinging to scraps, facing an enemy so rich in resources that even its battlefield luxuries outshone German necessities. To the historian's eye, these small acts illuminate the larger truth. War is not fought by weapons alone. It is fought by economies, by cultures, by the ability to sustain not only soldiers' bodies but their spirits. The Americans, consciously or not, understood this. Every cigarette, every stick of gum, every chocolate bar carried to the front was a reminder of what they fought for and of the home that waited behind them. For the Germans, every taste of those same luxuries was a reminder of what they had lost and of an enemy who fought with a wealth that no propaganda could conceal. As the Ardennes campaign unfolded, as towns like Bastogne became symbols of resistance and desperation, The candy stories lingered at the edges of battle. They were whispered among German soldiers, carried into POW camps, and later remembered in memoirs. Not grand battles, not decisive maneuvers, but small, surreal moments in which the imbalance of the war revealed itself in the simplest form, a piece of sweetness falling from the sky. By the time the Ardennes offensive raged through the frozen forests of Belgium, the Germans had already begun whispering among themselves about an American advantage they could not measure with steel or gunpowder. They had seen the Sherman tanks, they had endured the thunderbolts, and they had felt the rain of Allied bombs upon their columns. But what unsettled them most was not the firepower, it was the abundance, the strange, almost mocking gestures that seemed to defy the logic of total war. And as rumors spread about candy falling from the skies, German soldiers began to suspect that their enemy carried with them something more dangerous than weaponry. Something hidden, something they could not match. The truth was both simple and profound. The United States had turned its industrial might into a war machine of unparalleled scale. And within that machine, logistics became the sharpest blade. To the Germans who fought on dwindling supplies, the candy drops were not random acts of mercy. They were a symptom of an advantage so deeply rooted that it could not be undone. The Americans were not starving. They were not rationing crumbs. They were fighting with surpluses, and those surpluses trickled down in ways that bewildered their enemies. A Hershey bar, harmless in itself, became a signal flare of dominance. But there was more than abundance at play. Behind every bar of chocolate, every stick of gum, there was a web of coordination that the Germans could scarcely imagine. American units were connected not only by supply lines, but by radios, by convoys, by an intricate system that ensured the front never ran dry. German soldiers watched with despair as American trucks rolled endlessly forward, while their own tanks sputtered on empty fuel lines. What they did not yet grasp was that even the smallest luxuries, the sweets, the cigarettes, the coffee packets, were part of this system. They were not accidents of war, but deliberate inclusions in the American vision of what a soldier needed to fight. The hidden advantage was psychological as much as material. The Germans were taught to believe in hardship as a virtue, that hunger and cold forged iron will. But on the battlefield, this doctrine faltered. Hunger weakened the body, and despair gnawed at the spirit. Meanwhile, American soldiers warmed their hands on tins of cocoa and chewed gum as they prepared for battle. To the Germans who captured such rations, or who tasted them as prisoners, the shock was overwhelming. These men fought with comfort. They fought with reminders of home. They carried not just rifles, but fragments of a world untouched by war. And in those fragments lay a hidden strength that made them fight longer, harder, with morale intact. For prisoners of war, the revelation was sharper still. German soldiers marched into captivity, often expected cruelty. They were taught to fear it, to resist it, but many found themselves offered candy, cigarettes, even coffee by their captors. It was not kindness alone. It was a statement. The Americans were showing them that they could afford to treat prisoners not with brutality, but with casual generosity, and in that generosity lay the deepest cut. A German officer later admitted that it unnerved his men far more than threats would have done. To be fed by the enemy, to be given sweets instead of blows, made them realize that they were utterly defeated, not only militarily but morally, culturally, existentially. There were darker interpretations as well. Some Germans convinced themselves that the candy was poisoned, that it must be a trick. They hesitated to eat, their paranoia heightened by propaganda that painted Americans as devious. But when nothing happened, when the chocolate was simply chocolate, the fear deepened. For it was easier to face an enemy who was cruel than one who was inexplicably merciful. Cruelty was expected. Mercy was alien and therefore terrifying. To drop candy instead of bombs was to shatter the framework by which soldiers understood war. It was to remind them that the Reich's promises of supremacy were hollow, and that their enemies had already surpassed them in ways they could not measure. The hidden advantage was also economic. Germany fought on the edge of collapse, its resources drained by years of total war. Factories lay in ruins, and the civilian population endured harsh rationing. American industry, by contrast, was expanding. Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, cities far from the battlefield, roared with production. Every month, more tanks, more planes, more ships, and within that tide of steel, Space was found for luxuries. Hershey produced millions of ration bars for the army. Wrigley's gum factories churned out packs by the ton. To the Americans, it was a matter of sustaining morale. To the Germans, it was proof that they faced an enemy who could not be exhausted. The psychological toll was immense. A German soldier could accept defeat at the hands of a tank. He could endure bombardment from the skies. But to be defeated by chocolate? To realize that his enemy fought with an abundance so vast that even luxuries became weapons, this was unbearable. It meant that the Reich's vision of strength through hardship was nothing but illusion. It meant that sacrifice and suffering had not created superiority, but weakness. The candy was not just food. It was the taste of inevitability, the flavor of defeat wrapped in silver foil. And so the story spread. Prisoners whispered about it in camps. Civilians repeated it in villages. The Americans dropped candy, they said. Not bombs, candy. The very absurdity of the tale gave it power. It carried with it both ridicule and awe, making German soldiers feel like relics of another age. They fought with desperation, yet their enemy fought with a confidence so deep it bordered on arrogance. The hidden advantage, then, was not only in logistics, not only in abundance, but in the psychological theater of war. By raining sweetness instead of fire, the Americans demonstrated that they had already transcended the battlefield. They were waging a war not just of weapons, but of ideas. In the end, the candy was a symbol, a cipher for something greater. It represented the full weight of American industrial power, the strength of supply lines that never broke, the ability to fight with both steel and sugar. The Germans could not match it. They could not understand it, and so they feared it. The hidden advantage was not hidden at all. It fell from the skies wrapped in paper, fluttering down like snowflakes upon a frozen battlefield. And for the men who tasted it, it was a reminder that their world was collapsing one sweet bite at a time. The candy was more than a curiosity. Behind every bar and every stick of gum lay a story of engineering, production, and logistics that spoke volumes about the way America waged war. The Germans, who lived and fought under constant scarcity, never fully grasped how deep the American supply system ran. To them, the appearance of chocolate on the battlefield felt like a taunt, an indulgence. But in truth, it was a carefully designed component of the war effort, shaped by scientists, engineers, and factory workers thousands of miles away. The most famous of these was the Hershey D-Ration bar. Conceived in 1937 at the request of the U.S. Army, it was not meant to be a treat, but a survival tool. Quartermaster Colonel Paul Logan approached Hershey with a challenge: create a chocolate bar that was compact, high in energy, resistant to heat, and sturdy enough to be carried into battle. Hershey's chief chemist, Samuel Hinkle, delivered a formula that was as bitter as it was dense. Each D-ration weighed 4 ounces, packed 600 calories, and could withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting. It contained chocolate, sugar, oat flour, cocoa fat, skim milk powder, and artificial flavoring. Soldiers joked that it tasted a little better than a boiled potato, but it did its job. It fueled men in combat when nothing else was available. From 1940 to 1945, more than 3 billion D-ration bars were produced. The Hershey factory in Pennsylvania operated around the clock, its conveyor belts carrying a steady tide of olive drab wrapped chocolate destined for every front of the war. Alongside the D-ration came the tropical bar, designed to survive the sweltering climates of the Pacific. Lighter, less bitter, but still engineered for endurance, it became another staple in the soldier's kit. These were not luxuries. They were military tools, born from engineering requirements, tested in laboratories, and mass-produced with industrial precision. Yet to the men who received them, especially the starving Germans who stumbled upon them, they were indistinguishable from luxury. The numbers themselves tell the story of America's hidden advantage. A single Hershey plant could turn out 24 million bars a week at peak production. Compare this to the German Führerprinzip-driven factories, bombed and broken, scrambling to produce weapons and shells with little thought given to soldier comfort. The contrast was staggering. German soldiers chewed on black bread and ersatz coffee substitutes, while Americans munched on gum between firefights. Canned gum itself was no accident. Wrigley, the great chewing gum manufacturer, halted civilian sales of its most popular brands during the war and dedicated its production entirely to the military. Packs of Wrigley's Spearmint and Doublemint became fixtures of the GI's ration kit, handed out as casually as ammunition. These items carried technical details every bit as fascinating as the weapons of war. The D rations packaging was triple-wrapped in foil and paper to protect against moisture. Its density made it nearly unchewable in cold weather, requiring soldiers to slice it with knives. The tropical bar, lighter and less caloric, was infused with special stabilizers to resist melting. Meanwhile, lifesavers and hard candies were added to rations not only for energy, but to keep mouths moist during long marches. Engineers calculated everything: caloric density, shelf life, transport weight, and resistance to climate. The result was a ration system unlike anything Germany fielded, one that extended beyond sustenance into morale. Factories in the United States became as important as any battlefield. The Hershey Chocolate Corporation, Wrigley, Coca-Cola, General Foods, all became war contractors. Hershey received the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production 5 times. Its workers, many of them women, labored tirelessly to churn out the sweet fuel of war. Conveyor belts ran alongside tank assembly lines, producing not weapons but sustenance. It was a vision of total war, in which every industry, from steel to sugar, was bent toward victory. And while candy sustained American troops, its effect on Germans who encountered it was psychological devastation. Consider the specifications of German rations. The standard Eiserne portion, iron ration, contained dry bread, a small amount of canned meat, and perhaps coffee substitute. By 1944, shortages reduced even this. Sugar was nearly absent, chocolate nearly unobtainable. German industry had produced its own chocolate substitute, but it was scarce and bitter. No equivalent existed to the American ration system. German chemists were tasked with building rockets and jets. American chemists designed chocolate bars that could survive the tropics. That contrast alone revealed where priorities and capabilities lay. Even in the realm of production numbers, the disparity was overwhelming. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 16 billion individual candy bars for the military. In Germany, rationing had reduced civilian chocolate consumption to near zero by 1942. A German soldier might not see chocolate for months. An American soldier carried it daily. The sheer scale was terrifying when revealed in something as deceptively small as a candy wrapper. The story of candy in the war also intersected with technology in unexpected ways. Radios, tanks, and aircraft relied on precision engineering, but so did the humble ration. Each chocolate bar was calculated to maximize endurance. Each stick of gum was wrapped for preservation. Factories used assembly line methods pioneered by Henry Ford, now turned to candy. Standardization was the hidden weapon. Just as every Sherman tank rolled off the line in uniform design, so too did every ration bar. Reliability, abundance, and predictability became strategic assets. To the historian, these details explain why German soldiers feared what seemed absurd. They did not fear the sweetness itself. They feared what it represented. A Hershey bar was a condensed symbol of industrial superiority, of a system that could mobilize not only tanks and planes, but also the comforts of civilian life. When they chewed the chocolate, they tasted the factories of Pennsylvania, the railroads of America, the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. They tasted a nation that fought not with desperation, but with confidence, planning, and engineering foresight. Thus, the technical deep dive reveals the truth behind the myth. The candy was not an afterthought. It was designed, engineered, and mass-produced with military precision. It carried calories, morale, and symbolism in every ounce. To a starving German soldier, it seemed surreal, almost supernatural, a gift or a mockery. But to the American system, it was simply another cog in the great war machine, planned, tested, produced, and delivered with the same relentless efficiency that churned out bombers and tanks. And so the wrappers that fluttered down in forests and fields became more than litter. They were technical marvels, small rectangles of science and industry, underestimated by those who saw only sweetness. The hidden advantage was not hidden at all. It lay in the very specifications, the caloric counts, the production quotas, and the factory schedules. It lay in a nation that could design weapons for the stomach as easily as it designed weapons for the battlefield. And in that, the Germans saw the future. A war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with the power of industrial abundance, calculated to the last calorie wrapped in silver foil. September 19, 1944. The Lorraine countryside lay beneath a heavy mist, dew clinging to the grass, as columns of German panthers moved cautiously through the fog near the village of Aracourt. The clatter of steel tracks echoed across the fields, a low growl that promised violence. To the German crews, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, this was familiar ground. They had fought the Red Army's armor and believed that against Americans, with their so-called inferior Shermans, victory was assured. Their doctrine was simple: engage, destroy, and push forward. But as the fog lifted, their confidence faltered. American forces seemed to move with uncanny coordination. Shermans appeared, fired, and vanished. Orders shifted rapidly across the battlefield. German tank commanders, accustomed to rigid hierarchies and slow communications, found themselves disoriented. What they did not yet know was that they were not just fighting tanks, they were fighting an invisible network. Radios crackled in every American vehicle, guiding movements, sharing targets, relaying orders. And within that web of voices and signals, even candy had played its part, carried as a symbol of abundance that reassured the GIs and bewildered the Germans. At Aracourt, the clash was fierce. 39 German Panthers roared forward, their 75mm high-velocity guns easily capable of piercing a Sherman at range. Yet they struggled to find their enemy. American crews, aided by fog radios and reconnaissance aircraft overhead, struck from unexpected angles. One Panther after another erupted in flames, their steel carcasses left smoldering in the fields. In just days of fighting, German forces lost nearly 86 tanks, while the Americans, though battered, held the field with fewer than 25 Shermans destroyed. German after-action reports described invisible enemies, units that seemed to vanish before counterfire could reach them. The technical superiority of the Panther's gun mattered little against the invisible hand of coordination. It was here that the disparity in rations and morale became another battlefield advantage. American soldiers, even under fire, sustained themselves with rations that carried not only calories, but a sense of normalcy. In the lull between battles, a GI might chew gum or unwrap a chocolate bar. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines to home, reminders of what they fought for. German crews, huddled in freezing steel hulls, gnawed at black bread, their stomachs hollow. When a captured American ration was found, complete with chocolate, it felt like stumbling upon treasure. And with that treasure came despair, the realization that their enemy fought not only with tanks and radios, but with comfort, with abundance, with a morale machine that kept men sharp and steady even in the chaos of battle. Another telling moment came months later, during the siege of Bastogne in December 1944. Encircled, cut off, and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne clung stubbornly to the town. German officers demanded surrender. General McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. To his men, freezing and under constant shelling, supplies became the thin line between survival and collapse. Then came the sound of engines overhead. Parachutes filled the sky, dropping crates of ammunition, food, and yes, candy. For the Americans in Bastogne, those supplies carried more than calories, they carried hope. For the Germans surrounding them, the sight of parachutes delivering not just bullets but sweets was chilling. They could not comprehend how their enemy, under siege, still found a way to deliver luxury. Where Germans expected hunger to weaken resolve, the Americans fought on with chocolate melting in their mouths. These moments etched themselves into memory. Prisoners taken at Aracourt spoke of the impossible coordination of the Americans. Prisoners from Bastogne whispered of the surreal scene of candy floating down among the bombs. For German intelligence officers, the reports were maddening. How could an army so young, so supposedly inexperienced, wield both material abundance and tactical innovation with such confidence? Their conclusions grew darker. The Americans were not only rich in resources, but masters of morale warfare. They fought with smiles on their faces, chewing gum as casually as they fired rifles. The Reich's soldiers, exhausted and starved, could not match such spirit. Numbers alone told a grim tale. At Aracourt, German losses dwarfed American casualties despite the superior armor of their Panthers. At Bastogne, the siege failed, broken by Allied counterattacks. And in each case, the small symbols mattered as much as the tanks. American units could resupply at astonishing speed, thanks to logistical convoys that never stopped. A Sherman could run out of shells and be resupplied within hours. A GI could run out of food and find candy bars in the next crate. German units, by contrast, often abandoned tanks for lack of fuel, surrendered for lack of ammunition, and starved for lack of rations. Candy, then, was not a joke. It was proof that the Americans never truly fought alone. They fought with the full weight of an economy behind them. German after-action reports began to include bewildering notes. Some mentioned soldiers demoralized after finding American rations on the battlefield. Others described POWs speaking with awe about the abundance of their captors. One officer scrawled in his diary that the Americans live like kings even at the front. To him, it was not simply unfair, it was terrifying. If the enemy could spare such luxuries for its soldiers, what hope was there of outlasting them? Each wrapper in the snow was a reminder of disparity, a small but powerful artifact of inevitability. Even in victory, the Americans carried candy as part of their triumph. Photographs from liberated towns show GIs surrounded by children, handing out chocolate and gum. To civilians, these moments symbolized freedom. To German soldiers watching from the shadows, they symbolized something else entirely: the collapse of the Reich's moral and material superiority. The war they fought with blood and sacrifice was being lost to an enemy who could turn sweetness into a weapon. At Aricourt and Bastogne, the battles were decided by tanks, artillery, and infantry. But beneath the roar of engines and the crack of rifles lay subtler forces: radios, logistics, and morale. And within morale, candy became a strange, powerful icon. For the Germans, it was a reminder that they fought an enemy who not only outgunned them, but outsupplied, outfed, and outcomforted them. For the Americans, it was fuel, comfort, and a piece of home wrapped in foil. And when dropped from the skies, it was a message: we have enough to fight you and feed ourselves, and still more to spare. In those battles, steel clashed with steel, fire consumed villages, and men died by the thousands. But in the quiet moments, when a chocolate bar was unwrapped or gum was chewed, the hidden truth of the war revealed itself. The Germans fought with desperation. The Americans fought with abundance. And in the end, abundance proved to be the deadliest weapon of all. War is fought not only with bullets and steel, but with the invisible weight of morale. In the frozen fields of Belgium and the battered villages of France, the Germans learned a lesson they could never forget. When the enemy fights with full stomachs, warm coats and candy bars in their pockets, the battlefield itself bends. The strategic and psychological impact of American abundance, embodied in something as trivial as chocolate, was devastating. German command structures were brittle, built on hierarchy. A platoon without its officer often floundered, unsure of its orders, waiting for commands that never came. Radios were scarce, their Fuji-5 sets limited in range and easily jammed by terrain. When leaders fell, units faltered. The Americans operated differently. Every tank had a radio. Every squad could adapt. If one leader was lost, another took command instantly. Orders passed like lightning, coordinating movements with a speed the Germans could not match. And within this system of connection came another subtle layer. Morale held firm because every soldier felt part of a larger, unbreakable whole. Candy was not the reason Americans won battles, but it became a symbol of the larger machine. Soldiers knew that somewhere behind them, convoys stretched for miles, warehouses brimmed with supplies, and factories back home never stopped. They knew they would be fed, clothed, armed, and cared for. When a GI chewed gum before stepping into battle, it was not mere habit. It was reassurance, a small act that said, "We are prepared, we are sustained, we will not be abandoned." To German soldiers, watching their enemies fight with such casual confidence was maddening. They crouched in trenches, gnawing hard bread, while across the lines Americans tossed chocolate to children and still had enough for themselves. The psychological toll was immense. In diaries and reports, German soldiers described the surreal fear of facing an opponent who seemed inexhaustible. One prisoner captured near Bastogne told his interrogators, "We could not believe it. You eat chocolate in the middle of battle while we have nothing." Another described the candy as a weapon that made us feel poor, beaten and forgotten. It was not just about hunger, it was about humiliation. The Reich had promised them supremacy, yet their captors fed them like children. For men raised in the culture of sacrifice, This was unbearable. Strategically, these small comforts amplified resilience. At Bastogne, American paratroopers under siege endured relentless shelling and bitter cold. Many froze, many starved, yet the arrival of supply drops, even with candy among the crates, transformed despair into defiance. Men who might have broken held the line. "When the parachutes came down, we knew we weren't alone," one veteran recalled. The chocolate was eaten, but more than that, it was believed in. It meant that the system still worked, that help would always arrive, and that no siege could crush their spirit. Against such morale, German hopes of forcing surrender collapsed. On the German side, the effect was corrosive. Soldiers questioned their leadership. Why did their enemies fight with plenty while they starved? Why did the Reich, which boasted of destiny and power, fail to provide even sugar to its fighters? The propaganda that had painted the Americans as weak, decadent, and cowardly no longer held. How could such decadence survive encirclement at Bastogne? How could weak soldiers defeat panthers at Aricourt? The contradictions gnawed at German morale, weakening resolve far more effectively than leaflets or speeches. Civilians added another dimension. In liberated towns, American GIs handing out chocolate became legends overnight. Children remembered the taste for decades, calling the soldiers chocolate boys. To the Germans, hearing these stories was crushing. Once greeted as conquerors, they were now despised occupiers, while their enemies were welcomed with cheers and gifts. Every child who reached for a candy bar became a living emblem of shifting loyalties. Every wrapper on the ground was a reminder that the Reich was losing not only battles but hearts and minds. Strategists after the war recognized this subtle power. Military theorists began to write about the total package of morale, the combination of logistics, psychology, and material comfort that sustained fighting forces. The Americans had not only built tanks and planes, they had built an ecosystem of abundance that translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. German generals admitted in post-war interrogations that their soldiers were demoralized not just by defeats, but by the visible prosperity of their enemies. As one put it, they lived better in war than we did in peace. The candy became shorthand for the gap between the two systems. To the Germans, it was humiliating proof of inadequacy. To the Americans, it was proof of identity. They fought as citizens of a nation so wealthy, so confident, that even in the furnace of war it could afford sweetness. And that confidence, woven into every ration and every convoy, made their armies unbreakable. The legacy of this psychological impact endured long after the war. German POWs remembered the shock of tasting chocolate in captivity, an experience so strange it haunted them. American veterans recalled the way children's faces lit up when they handed out gum or candy, memories as vivid as the battles themselves. These small acts reshaped the narrative of the war, painting the Americans not only as warriors, but as providers, bearers of abundance and symbols of hope. In the clash of doctrines, the Americans had mastered something the Germans could not replicate: the marriage of material power and psychological warfare. Tanks and guns broke the enemy's body. Candy broke his spirit. And in the long winter of 1944, that spirit was as vital a battlefield as any hill or crossroads. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the shattered landscapes of Europe bore witness to a truth that had been visible long before the Reich collapsed. Germany had built formidable machines of war, tanks with thicker armor, artillery with longer range, aircraft that pushed the boundaries of speed. Yet in the end, it was not the fiercest weapons that prevailed, but the system that held them together. America's hidden advantage was not a single innovation, not a single weapon, but the ability to fight with abundance, to carry comfort alongside firepower, to wage war as though it were already won. For German prisoners of war, the memory of candy falling from the skies or being pressed into their hands by their captors became a symbol they never forgot. Some recalled it with disbelief, others with humiliation, but most admitted decades later that it shattered their perception of the enemy. They had been told Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of enduring true hardship. Yet in captivity, they discovered an enemy who fought hard, killed without hesitation, and then offered a chocolate bar as casually as passing a cigarette. The contradiction was more frightening than cruelty. Cruelty was predictable. Kindness was a sign of overwhelming superiority, the gesture of a victor who had nothing to fear. Historians would later draw parallels between these wartime experiences and the lessons carried into the Cold War. American strategists recognized that morale, supply and abundance were not secondary to victory but central. The doctrine of network-centric warfare, connecting every unit with radios, supply chains, and shared information, was born in these fields. Just as radios linked Sherman tanks in Aracourt, candy linked soldiers to home, reinforcing their spirit. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, the pattern repeated. American forces fought not only with weapons but with systems that ensured no soldier fought alone, no unit starved, no morale withered. The sweet taste of chocolate in the Ardennes was the beginning of that lesson. The legacy also endured among civilians. In post-war Germany, children remembered chocolate bombers, American pilots who dropped candy attached to tiny parachutes during the Berlin airlift of 1948. For them, sweets became the currency of hope, the symbol of survival in a blockaded city. That act, born of the same wartime abundance, cemented America's image not only as a conqueror but as a benefactor. The same candy that had once terrified German soldiers became the bridge to reconciliation, binding former enemies with the simplest of gifts. The message was unmistakable. Where the Reich brought only hunger, the Americans brought plenty. On the strategic stage, generals admitted what soldiers had whispered in their diaries. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reflecting on the war, acknowledged bitterly, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." It was not just tanks. It was radios, convoys, and yes, candy bars that represented the connective tissue of American power. Germany's war machine fought with brilliance but isolation. America's fought with unity, abundance, and the unshakable morale that came from fighting with reminders of home. For veterans, the memories of candy and war remained deeply personal. Some American soldiers recalled the joy of tossing sweets to children on liberated roads, their small hands reaching for something they had not tasted in years. Others remembered the surreal act of handing chocolate to surrendering Germans, watching their hardened expressions falter as sweetness melted on their tongues. For German veterans, the memory was more haunting. They spoke of the humiliation, the confusion, the dread of realizing that their enemy could fight a war of annihilation and still pause to drop candy from the sky. It was a lesson in contrasts, one they carried for the rest of their lives. The lesson for history is stark. Firepower alone does not win wars. Technology, strategy, and doctrine matter, but they are hollow without the system that sustains them. America proved that victory lies in connection, between soldiers and commanders, between battlefront and home front, between morale and material. The chocolate bar, trivial in itself, became the emblem of that truth. It showed that when a nation fights with abundance, when it carries the comforts of peace into the crucible of war, it wields a power greater than any weapon, the ability to sustain the spirit as well as the body. And so the story endures. In the forests of Belgium, where snow once lay stained with blood, soldiers found candy among the wreckage of war. In the skies above Berlin, children saw parachutes carrying sweets instead of bombs. From those moments came a lesson that outlived the Reich, outlived the Cold War, and still echoes today. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor, but abundance, sustained and shared, conquers both. In the end, the Germans were not undone by a single battle nor by a single weapon. They were undone by a nation that could wage war with tanks and planes while still raining chocolate from the sky. A nation that turned sweetness into a weapon, comfort into strategy, and abundance into victory. That was the true terror for the men who once thought themselves invincible. For them, defeat did not taste of ash or blood. It tasted of chocolate,